Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game faction focus for JSA Oban. In this video, we'll be talking about who JSA Oban are, what are their strengths, weaknesses, and general faction identity, before jumping into Infinity Army as usual to go through many of the profiles that showcase those strengths. Now, as a quick reminder, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube, and this video goes out to channel supporter Karatse. They are a newer player who notes they have been playing Oban as their first army and having a really good time with it, but feel that they would benefit from a faction focus for Oban in N5 so they can get a better idea of how each piece works. Could I say this faction focus is for you, and I hope very much that you enjoy it. Now, how do JSA Oban play? Well, let's talk first about the fantasy of the army because it is one of the clearest in the game. This is the maximum weeaboo faction. You have ninjas, you have samurai, you have miniatures that are a clear reference to Ghost in the Shell. If you are playing Infinity for the anime vibes, this is one of the factions for you. Now that means the faction has some incredible models, but it also means that it's designed mechanically to lend itself to certain strengths. And the foremost of these strengths, which is close combat, has actually been a source of a great deal of friction for JSA players historically, basically back to N3 when JSA first came into itself as its own sectoral army. Now, JSA have always been, since inception, the best at close combat in the game, both in terms of high watermark profiles. There are two profiles in the entire game with CC values of 25 and Martial Arts 5, and both of them are in formerly JSA, now JSA Oban, which is the inheritor to the old sectoral. But also just in terms of there is good close combat everywhere in this faction. In any given JSA Oban list, you are likely to have multiple pieces, like 4 or 5 or 6 or more pieces in a list, which, should they get into close combat, they will mess up something many, many times their points because of the power of the close combat skill. Now, in N5, there have been changes large and small to this dynamic. Now, the smallest of these changes, relatively speaking, is actually just general improvements to martial arts to make martial artists like are present in JSA Oban true high watermark power. Martial arts level 5 is as powerful as it has ever been. There are no longer hard counters to it. If you get into close combat with models with martial arts 3, 4, 5, and good close combat scores, you are just very, very, very likely to do critical damage to your opponent with those pieces. That, however, is kind of the less important change. The larger and more important change is just pieces that have been added to JSA Oban relative to the faction that it used to be, baseline JSA. And those are things like Yanyans and Tenkos Senai with disco ball profiles, things that allow you to control visibility on the battlefield. Because as good as close combat is, right? As incredibly likely as you are to both win a face-to-face roll and mess up your opponent if you connect with a good close combatant, you have to get into close combat. That is difficult. That is challenging. And while JSA enjoyed a period that was kind of like a peak of strength at the very, very beginning of N4, when all of their kind of heavy infantry close combat pieces got relative points buffs and everyone was still riding the N3 conventional wisdom of you never take hackers for any reason, that peak of strength very, very quickly declined as people learned how to play a defensive game that worked and incorporated hacking and other ARO pieces, and generally just the meta that emerged as the mature meta of N4 came into being and has translated into N5. You cannot really just Banzai Samurai charge your opponent and hope that that will do the trick to get you into close combat, certainly if you want the efficiency of close combat to actually deliver on its promise. Close combat is no good if you have to get there over the pile of corpses 100 points high just to kill one high-value enemy piece. And it's the presence of things like Yanyans and Disco Balls on Tanko that have made such a big difference, because that represents visibility control. And if you can just smoke out, from there, you can sneak your way into close combat without any of the risk of being shot and bring that incredible close combat power to bear. Now, that isn't the sole strength of JSA, but it is really where we have to start talking about JSA Oban. You have very, very good close combat. It is the best anywhere in the entire game in JSA Oban, both in terms of high watermark and quantity. And as a general rule, you aren't going to make a JSA list without some of that present. Now, what other strengths do we have? Well, translating from samurai, right, the armored samurai trope, The armored samurai pieces are all fairly solid and efficient, not just because they have good close combat, but because they are cheap and effective heavy infantry, and that's a really good thing to have in N5. Almost all of them have stealth, which is nice as well, because it's one of the ways to mitigate hacking in terms of the hacking weaknesses of those heavy infantry. And you can build fairly serviceable, just solid heavy infantry corps, Harris or core teams. We will actually see a heavy infantry core team in one of the two lists we'll showcase at the end of this faction focus video. Supplementing that, you've got really quite good medium to expensive pieces. Stuff like the more elite ninja, the bikers, Ryuken Unit 9, the remote packages, etc. All of this represents a fairly solid middleweight element of the faction, and this is the really important thing, those are kind of like luxury pieces, the more expensive samurai, the more expensive ninja, those are enabled by probably the best low-end, cheap and cheerful infantry core to support all of that in the entire game. Now, there's a bit of argument, there's a bit of quibbling you can do about, okay, what is the best light infantry core element in the game? But deeply in contention are Kesotsu line infantry, and the presence of them, linkable in JSA Oban, deserves mention just as a core faction strength by itself. Now, despite the changes JSA has seen in its transition to JSA Oban, there are still limitations baked into the faction. One of them, as I mentioned, is that if you want to get into close combat, you have to do the work. Close combat is a supplementary tool most of the time. Even in JSA Oban, there will almost never be games where the majority of your kills are scored in close combat. Sometimes, yes, that will be the case. There can be games where, for example, you might be going second in armory and all you have to do every turn is smoke out, run into the armory with a bunch of close combat experts, murder everything inside, and repeat the process for 3 turns. But generally, JSA Oban are not forgiven from playing the same game that everyone else is. You have to do things like gunfight, and the gunfighting in Oban is fairly mediocre. It's not unsalvageable, but this is a faction where you will, for example, never combine a heavy machine gun with a visual modifier. Straight up, the best gunfighter in the entire faction is a Rushi under the right circumstances, and that is just a cheap combat remote with functionally no armor, single wound, etc. You can and will get gunfighting kills in JSA Oban. You will use gunfighting the same way other factions do, but you have to recognize that that is one of the limitations of the faction. It is not a strength of Oban that they have easy to apply core power gunfighting pieces. In addition, the hacking game of JSA Oban is fairly limited. It's not non-existent, but it's right on that. This is just enough hacking for general kind of defensive and occasional play. Now, that still immediately puts them in a position where they're better off, for example, than the entirety of Ariadna, because there are some solid hackers in JSA Oban, but it is really just stuff like Willpower 12 Kesotsu and Aragotto killer hackers that are basically carrying the faction's entire game in that respect. There's also no network projection. When I say network projection, I mean things like fast pandas and pissed pitches. If you want to get your repeater areas forward, really the only way to do it is to run a combat remote forward like a Rushi. Now, Rushi are pretty good, and they are pretty good in JSA Oban, but that does not make a powerful and robust aggressive hacking presence. Hacking in JSA Oban is pretty strictly defensive and a little bit of utility. It's still present, but it's a limitation. And when we say things like, the faction has limited gunfighting and the faction has limited hacking, these are significant limitations in the context of how N5 plays. Those are powerful and useful tools, and you have just enough of them in JSA Oban. And so playing JSA Oban really does rely on maximizing the strengths you have and then bringing just enough gunfighting, just enough hacking to still be able to play those parts of the game. And happily, that is something that JSA Oban absolutely can. We will see a little bit of hacking and some solid gunfighting in both of the lists that I show off at the end of this episode, and that will exist in support of close assault pieces, close combat experts, cool skirmish elements, fast and zippy things, high mobility, etc., which collectively is where Oban sits and some of the cool stuff that it can do. Now, I could talk a little longer here, but actually in JSA Oban's case, so many of the core strengths that they have are actually just tied to, yeah, it's this profile or this regiment that shows off what the strength is. And so basically, and without further ado, let's jump into Infinity Army and start going through the many profiles that make JSO Oban what it is. Now, As I mentioned, one of the core strengths of JSA Oban is that all of the heavy infantry and cool skirmishers and kind of interesting but moderately expensive 20 to 30 to 40 point pieces are supported by possibly the best cheap line infantry in the game. And so we are starting, as we usually do, with our link teams, and that starts with our light infantry link teams, and that means Kesotsu Butai. Now, these guys have always been cheap, but only in N5 have they become a regiment that is also just really, really effective thanks to a number of tools that have been added to them. And there are a few profiles that we're going to call out here as particularly relevant, but the important thing to note is that there are just cheap elements across the board here, including a 9-point lieutenant. Ignore the half SWC cost, you will almost always be able to afford that in JSA Oban. And that means that basically any JSA Oban list can include a Haris and a core or both of these as necessary to cheaply fill out your list and support the rest of whatever this list is doing. In terms of gunfighting from Kasotsu Butai, we don't want them to be doing too much, but if you need to do some gunfighting, 0 SWC and 12 points for the ballistic skill attack -3 Thunderbolt is where you want to go. Now, this lad is only going to be Ballistic Skill 11 Burst 2 +1 Special Die, unless you run a much larger link team, but 2 dice on 11s in ARO with Ballistic Skill Attack -3 is sufficient to threaten and or stall out quite a lot of attacks that aren't really dedicated to suppressing it. You have to bring up an actual gun to deal with something like that, particularly if you're making full use of the Thunderbolt's range bands. And that means that for just 12 points, you have a piece that is kind of difficult to efficiently answer by most enemy armies. Now, you won't want to just send these guys to their deaths, right? Use them judiciously. But if you need these, either as active or reactive pieces, 12 points for this as a gunfighter, like you don't get a better return on your points cost than that. Next up, and kind of similarly and notable, is our more expensive but still cheap for what you get 16 point and half an SWC hacker. Now, is it fair to say that willpower 12 hackers are not fantastic? Yes, that is the lowest willpower of any hacker in the game, but firstly, 16 points is still cheap. Secondly, in many JSA lists, you will have maybe 1 or 2 repeaters in your deployment zone, giving you just that terminal approach area covered by a hacking area, and there are many things in the game that do not want to be suffering from even willpower 12 hacking arrows while they are vectoring in to make the run on your deployment zone. Covering that 8 inches beyond your deployment zone and then inside your deployment zone itself with just a few models and presenting that threat makes certain attacking elements much less willing to commit to that run. And even if we're doing something like moving a Rushi up into the midfield, which JSA can absolutely do, we will talk about that in a future link, just having that Rushi also threaten a zone of control, hacking ARO is useful to have. Now, if it was just a 16-point hacker, it would not be a particularly good buy at willpower 12, but 2 rules that are very important here. The first is ECM hacker -6, which means going and dealing with these things proactively by your opponent is actually really annoying. That is a modifier that stacks with Firewall, although much of the time what will happen is your opponent will try and drop a picture on your head and then hack you through their Firewall. But even a solid hacker, willpower 14 with Trinity, is going to try and be rolling 3 dice on 11s to punch through your ECM hacker. Now they will probably get there eventually, but that is going to cause those hacking attacks to often take a frustrating amount of time, particularly if you throw in the occasional past save against Trinity's damage 6, which makes neutralizing this cheap and effective hacking arrow presence itself frustrating, kind of like how dealing with the Thunderbolt is annoying. Finally, on top of all of that, we have Crazy Koalas as a piece of deployable equipment, which means that if, or even if you do or you don't have baggage, you can just use that as a way of spending a few extra orders. You can just throw those perimeter weapons out, and they can contribute meaningfully to your defense. Having a Kasotsu Butai hacker in either your first or your second combat group means that you will always have an outlet for any extra orders that you might want to spend after you finish whatever it was you're trying to do in a turn. That's just generally very useful. Now, a few other profiles that are worth mentioning. There's a paramedic in here. Yep, excellent. Always good to have access to one of those. But then there are also AP rifle profiles, and those are the cheapest ones. 9 points for an AP rifle is still going to give you access to armor-piercing rounds, but more importantly, it's a linkable 9-point regular order, which means that we can be spending as little as like 37 points, gets us a 3-person Kusatsu Haris that can do plenty of different things in the game and still provides 3 regular orders. We can cheapen that down even further if we don't think we need the hacker. Right, we can save another 4 or 5 points by making the specialist in the team a forward observer or a paramedic, or by making it one of the other models that you will often link with Kusatsu Butai, the Kempotai. Now, as far as models like Kempotai go, they are not exactly the most efficient in the game, but they're pretty close. 17 points is, I think, the second cheapest you can get Chain of Command anywhere in the game, and that opens up certain options in terms of lieutenant profiles, which JSA does usually want to make use of. Now, yes, a Kempotai is 8 points more expensive than a 9-point Kasotsu lieutenant that you could just throw in and hope that they survive. And that is a consideration you will want to take into account when you're doing list construction with JSA Oban. Often it will just be best and cheapest to just take a 9-point Kasotsu and a decoy and fling them in the back and hope that they're safe. But if you're looking to try and maximize things like order pools, you have access to a +1 order lieutenant in this faction and NCOs to spend those orders. And there are a couple of other active lieutenant profiles as well we'll be covering over the course of this video that make cheap chain of command pretty appealing. Now, there are more than just the 17-point profiles here, but don't take them. Take the 17-point boarding shotgun profile. All of the rest are not worth your time in this particular case. It is the cheap and cheerful chain of command that we're looking for from the Kempotai. Kempotai count as Kasotsu when they are in a link. They can wildcard in. They can also jump into other fire teams if you need a chain of command specialist there, but usually the best place to have one of these is hanging out as part of a little Kasotsu team where he can be a specialist if need be, but otherwise is providing very valuable insurance against lieutenant death in the case that that could happen, enabling your lieutenant to lead the charge as needed. Now, on to our next fire team, and we get into the Samurai Heavy Infantry fire team. In fact, the Domaru fire teams. And it is in Domaru that we start to see the emergence of, oh wow, that's really quite good close combat, isn't it? And sitting pretty at Martial Arts Level 3, CC24, with access to very high damage EM CCWs, it is in Domaru that we see our first model clocking in at like 20 points that is, in a pinch, capable of taking down almost anything in the entire game if it can just connect with that sword. Now, while there are nominally a few different profiles here that might be worth our consideration, mostly what I'm going to suggest you use Domaru Butai for is their close combat expertise. Ballistic skill 12, even with ballistic skill attack SR-1, is not it's not good. You do not want to be taking face-to-face rolls with these if you can avoid it. Now, you might occasionally, if you think you need to. In particular, if you come around a corner and you threaten to fork that chain rifle with something like the Contender that we see on many of these models, well, doing that in the order before you close into close combat might be worth your time. But by and large, these should be considered close combat models and close assault models with the grenades and the chain rifles primarily. Yes, there is a Spitfire profile, but at 1.5 SWC and 31 points for a Ballistic Skill 12 model, we can do much, much better, and we will when we get into the very next profile that can be added to this fire team. Now, you will occasionally see the Domaru Forward Observer taken just because he's the only specialist you can access without breaking link team bonuses or diminishing link team bonuses in this fire team. In a small fire team, that doesn't particularly matter. If you don't need specialists, that doesn't particularly matter. But sometimes the only option is to slap that Forward Observer in there and just live with the fact that you're paying an awful lot of points to upgrade a chain rifle to a combi rifle. But he is a necessary evil occasionally. The other profile that is very much worth your time is the +1 order chain rifle contender EM grenades EMCCW lieutenant. As mentioned, there aren't a ton of NCOs in this faction, but you can absolutely access them. And because you can access NCOs, cheap access to lieutenant +1 order is a very valuable skill. Now, this is the kind of lieutenant profile that really wants you to take chain of command, so there is a bit of an expense on top of paying the 23 points for lieutenant +1 order, but it is one of the ways of rounding out your order pool in JSA, particularly if you're looking to do close assault actions. Those are order intensive. You have to cross the board and get all the way into close combat. You don't have the luxury of shooting your opponent from 20 or 30 inches away. And so any orders you can generate that let you close that gap help make those kind of assaults practical. And the Domaru Butai Lieutenant is one of the ways of getting that. He has the very, very valuable EMCCW, he has the full close combat, he is often going to be one of the best close combat pieces to capitalize on actually engaging in a fire team that he's in, and we will see him in one of the lists at the end of this video. Now, I mentioned NCO pieces. Technically speaking, there are two regiments with access to NCO in JSA Oban. However, only one of them is remotely worth talking about, and that is the Daiokai Dengengatai, but happily, it is absolutely worth talking about. Now, it packs what might be considered actually pretty okay close combat in many other factions with CC21 and Martial Arts Level 2, and that does mean that if your opponent jumps it in close combat, it can probably hold its own, but that is not really what we're taking it for. Yes, you will occasionally use that CC weapon in scenarios that require access to anti-material close combat, because it is actually quite good there, but what this guy mostly is a durable NCO gunfighter that can link with, well, actually it can link with both Kasotsu and Damaru. It breaks, or it doesn't contribute to the fire team bonuses in either case, it doesn't count as either of those, but you can put a Daiokai Dengengatai in with two Kasotsu and have actually a totally serviceable resilient firepower platform. It's only ballistic skill 13, but it's rolling a ton of dice, and it's tough as guts because it has armor 5, BTS 3, 2 wounds, and no wound incapacitation. Now, in a Kusatsu fire team, it's mostly just big and durable gunfighting presence, right? Only ballistic skill 13, we don't love that. You can get it to 14 by taking it alongside a full 4 other Kusatsu, and ballistic skill 14 burst 5 is pretty solid. That's a build your own HRMC. But it can also serve as an able ARO piece in those kind of cases if it just gets given +1 special die, because the Panzerfaust is really solid at that. You can take 2 back-to-back AROs, firing 1 dice +1 special dice in each, and if either of those connects, and you can really hold long enough to have the crack at connecting with those, you just hit your opponent with a Panzerfaust. In a Domaru fire team, he operates a little bit more differently. There, yes, absolutely, he is also a gunfighting element, rolling in at burst 5, trying to get to ballistic skill 14 some of the time, but he's also really important there because if you've taken the +1 lieutenant order Damaru, then the Daiokai is your outlet for those lieutenant orders. You can use the NCO, plus potentially access to tactical awareness on the next piece that we'll look at, to get up to 13 orders on a Damaru fire team, and that's a really, really healthy order count. That will let you move across the battlefield, either laying your own zero visibility zones or having support from other pieces in the army, get to where you need to go, take gunfights if you need them, and then close into close combat. Now, in a pinch, you do still have the option of combining gunfighting with a close assault charge. And that is a tactic that JSA have used since time immemorial, and you can still use it, but generally speaking, it's something that I would want to be fairly judicious about. Just in case you're wondering how that works, it is entirely possible to activate your link team, have the Domaru be the link leader, and just start closing the gap through open ground. Your opponent, yeah, they might be able to shoot any of the other activating pieces, but something is going to get there, and if they don't engage the Domaru, it will just shoot them unopposed. And so your opponent is forced to choose between engaging the Daiokai Dengengatai in a face-to-face roll, which it is usually fine at least surviving, potentially even winning, or taking shots against the Damaru and Tanku that are closing in over open ground, under covering fire from the Daiokai. Now, my personal preference, if you want to do that, just lay some smoke first. You can do that in this faction now, but every now and again there will be a situation where a heavy infantry fire team is cut off from support and needs to make a kill, and if you absolutely need to do that, you make the Daiokai the link leader, you have it step out and take a face-to-face roll, and you have the Damaru and Tanku start the charge, knowing that if they just get within 8 inches, they can declare a berserk, and if they can declare a berserk on something, they will probably kill it. Now, I mentioned Tanku, and so our next piece are Tenkos Senbutai. These guys used to be the real backbone of efficient heavy infantry in JSA. Definitely not the case anymore. I would be leaning more towards Domaru as the cheaper elements in my link teams, because Domaru have Frenzy, whereas Tenkos and Senputai straight up have limited cover. However, there is one very, very important Tenkos and Senputai profile that you will want to have access to in your armies, and that is the very last one down there, the Deactivator with a Disco Baller. Now, this is not the only source of Eclipse zero visibility zones in this army, but you want to have as many of those as you can, kind of just as a default position because of all of your good close combat, and disco balls are very, very easy zero visibility zones to use. They use the Tenko's actually quite solid ballistic skill 13, they benefit from fire team bonuses, they benefit from range bands and special die, and they allow you to very precisely place zero visibility zones at fairly long range, which can just be very efficient in terms of closing the gap and getting kills. With the deactivator, the Tanko can also turn them on again in subsequent turns, although in my experience so far, that's something that's fairly rare to happen. Now, That's really, really useful. Otherwise, the Tenko is not particularly fantastic at piece, but hey, that's 19 points. It's 19 points and it has 2 wounds. There is a limit to how much we can complain there. Just be aware that if you get the Tenko into close combat, it is going to possibly be one of those rare pieces that will actually let you down in JSA, and that's because it's packing a monofilament CC weapon. Monofilament CC weapons have got very limited damage. It is just 8. It is very easy to pass that. You have a 40% chance for any model to pass a save against a monofilament CC weapon. And Tenko are only, quote-unquote, martial arts level 2, which means that they're usually only rolling 1 dice. They have a less likely chance of critting than something like a Damaru. By comparison, if a Damaru gets into close combat, it's got martial arts 3, it's got higher CC score, it's got an extremely dangerous EM CCW, which inflicts multiple hits against half BTS. The Damaru is just the more dangerous melee piece, but we still take usually 1 Tenkos Senbutai in any Damaru link because it's still a heavy infantry, it's still got 2 wounds, and it brings the disco. You can also run a very self-contained melee murder duo of a Tenkos Senbutai and Miyamoto Musashi, who we'll talk about soon, which is really just lay the disco balls, get into close combat. That's a very, very focused duo, but can be very fun. More often, I'm going to see things like Tenko in fire teams with Damaru. Now, in terms of just rounding out what can go in the Damaru fire team, special character Damaru Takeshi Niko Oyama is basically just a Damaru with EMCCW and tactical awareness. You pay for a couple of other bells and whistles. He gets the DACCW as well in case you ever need that, particularly for missions that require you to use anti-material CCWs. But in all other respects, he is pretty much just a Damaru, but with tactical awareness. And that's good. That's actually really useful. Here's the means by which you get a pure or semi-pure Damaru link, maybe with a Daiokai and a Tenko. You can get 3 troops easily, but up to 4 or even like 4-person link bonuses in a full 5-person team, and be packing 13 orders to go and do your business between the Damaru Lieutenant +1 order and Damaru Takeshi Niko Oyama. I don't really recommend taking the Lieutenant profile of Oyama. You can, it's just that it is more efficient to combine him with the Damaru +1 order lieutenant, since we're taking a Daiokai as well, to hit that real in-faction high watermark on order count. Otherwise, he does all of the things that a Damaru does, which is to really, really kill stuff in close combat. Now, since I mentioned Miyamoto Musashi, it's Miyamoto Musashi. He does one thing and one thing only, which is win close combat attacks. There's not really a ton more to say about him. Usually you will pay for the 25-point version. You will duo him with a Tenko that is a pure fire team. He counts as a Tenko for the purposes of that link team composition, and the Tenko's job is to lay down disco balls to get Musashi into close combat. If Musashi gets into close combat, you will kill your opponent because he's martial arts level 5, potentially getting extra dice from the Tenko being in close combat as well, and CC 25, and he has an armor-piercing explosive damage 4 close combat weapon. Now, frankly, that's all rather gratuitous, and you get so much other close combat in JSA that there's really no particular need to run this little duo. Like, it's fun, and if you want to roll the biggest possible CC dice in the game, this is how you do it. But there are just so many other things in JSA that will mess your opponent up in close combat that this is kind of like, it's just not particularly necessary. But it is fun and it is a flex, so be aware of it. It makes a good duo, Tenko and Miyamoto. Now, there is one more link team to mention that is particularly of note, and that is the Aragotto Advance Guard Banzai Fire Team link. Now, Aragotto can absolutely be used on their own merits. These things are virtually warbands. 8.6 is very, very, very fast, and the cheapest of them at 13 points with a boarding shotgun and a boarding pistol to come around corners and take face-to-face rolls that way can make just very efficient, very, very rapid close combat pieces. But these are actually some of my favorite elements in JSA to form a fire team. The Banzai fire team is actually just kind of hilarious and self-contained and excellent, and it almost always wants to include each of 3 things. The first is your Aragotto of choice. I would generally probably recommend against the Spitfire because we're going to have a Spitfire in another source in terms of this fire team, but either of the hackers or the boarding shotgun are all just fine and efficient. They're zippy as hell, they can be used disposably, but in the short term what they'll be doing is giving link team bonuses. Link team bonuses in combination with the Kroshi Rider. This is another anime reference. This is a direct and extremely visible reference to the Durara anime. And while she is much more expensive than a Aragotto Advanced Guard, she counts as one for purposes of fire team bonuses, and she has a couple of things that they don't. The first is actual close combat, and since we are moving so quickly, getting her into close combat, yes, it's only martial arts 1, yes, it's an AP shock CCW, but she can jump on models that can't really defend themselves, make use of that CC23, win close combat rolls that way, and she has a smoke grenade launcher. Smoke grenade launchers with link bonuses are really solid in N5. 2 dice on 12s is a good reliable chance to land that +1 special die, to land that smoke grenade basically anywhere you need it within 24 inches. And there are a multitude of models that benefit from having smoke laid for them in this faction. She is one of them. She can use smoke to get into close combat. But it's also of extreme benefit to, say, Domaru fire teams, other close combat experts, or smoke shooting, which we'll talk about next. Otherwise, she's a specialist. She's a native willpower 14 forward observer, which means that if you want to take the 13-point Aragotto, you can do so in the knowledge that there is still a specialist in this fire team. And while Dogged is not my favorite skill, if you need to either just hold the enemy up for +1 order or commit to an attack deep into the enemy deployment zone, knowing it's a one-way trip, you can and will actually make use of Dogged on this model. Now, once we have our Aragotto and we have our Kroshi Rider, we have our cheap pieces, we have our specialist, we have our linked smoke grenade launcher, we are going to add one more piece to this fire team, and that is the Rushi Spitfire, which is going to be +1 special die, MSV2 Spitfire. It's 6-4 movement, which is not as fast as the motorcycles, but it is still pretty quick, and so it can move very quickly up the field alongside them. The Kroshi Rider can lay smoke, and then the Rushi, with or without support wear, can shoot through that smoke and actually is the best gunfighter in the faction. If you slap support wear on this thing, it's 5 dice, imposing the shooting through smoke penalty on the enemy, usually rolling 15s to hit itself, and ignoring basically every enemy modifier because it's an MSV2. Now, is this thing going to dislodge a tag? No. Is it going to completely mess up a total reaction bot your opponent put on Overwatch? Yes. On top of that, it's also a repeater that your game plan involves actively moving around the board. And since there are no other means of projecting hacking networks in JSA, that's actually super valuable. Rushi are present in an awful lot of factions. You can actually see the number of factions underneath the troop designation on the entry there. But I would honestly argue that with very few exceptions, they are at their absolute best in JSA Oban. Yes, this is just a humble combat remote, but do not be afraid to take one and get as much use out of it as you can in this faction because it genuinely shores up some of the weaknesses the faction would otherwise have. I really like this fire team. You will see the fire team of Aragotto, Kroshi Rider, and Rushi, I think, in both of the lists at the end of this video. That is how much I like it, and I very strongly recommend it. Now, segueing from our linked warband equivalent pieces to our actual warband equivalent pieces, the Yan Yan. You can only have 2 in JSA Oban. You probably should have 2 in JSA Oban. Maybe 1, but generally 2. Now, there is an awful lot to recommend to these guys, starting with the fact that they are 6 or 7 points. You will usually only take the cheapest profiles, and actually either is totally fine. It's alright to upgrade to the 7.1, but do not feel pressured to. Yan Yan have booty, and so are just going to randomly roll up close combat weapons plenty of the time. But more importantly, the 6-point profile has a heavy pistol, which it can fork with the chain rifle, which genuinely may actually be more valuable than the damage 6 DACCW. Either way, these are Fizz 14 smoke grenade models with Impetuous, which makes them very good at providing smoke cover for other elements in your army that want to advance up the field. And while their close combat is not fantastic, I mean, it's 22, that's a decent score, but there's no martial arts, that is enough to still run into close combat and at least threaten a strict non-expert. Booty gives them a little bit of high roll potential, where they just randomly roll up Mimetism 6 or Armor 4 or Monofilament CCW, and Super Jump Jet Propulsion is comfortably one of the best skills to have access to in the game. It gives them true absolute mobility. They move 6 inches on the first short skill if they want to, and should just have absolutely no trouble at all getting around the battlefield. Now, they also have Combat Jump. They land on only 11s, not 14s, but they can land on 11s or parachute in off the table. Do that sparingly. Now, it is absolutely fine to just, yeah, if you think it's going to be useful, hold back the Yan-Yans and just go for the combat jump if you think it's something you can capitalize on. It's something mostly if you see like what your opponent is deploying, or if you want to fake out the presence of infiltrators, things like ninjas, etc. There are plenty of games you can play with the Yan Yan just in terms of concealing their presence using Parachutist. But in my opinion, it is so valuable to have good, reliable smoke grenade throwers leading the way for the close assault elements that make up so much of the rest of JSA, that much of the time you actually should feel totally fine just deploying them normally in a position where they can take an impetuous activation and throw smoke using that, and then lead the way as the utterly expendable tip of the spear, running ahead of things like your Samurai Link teams. Basically, the rule of thumb is remember that combat jump and parachutist exist, keep it in mind, but don't consider it the default. Consider it something that you do when you think you can take advantage of it, not always use it. Either way, the addition of these guys is possibly the most significant change to JSA across editions. When JSA Oban materialized and becoming what it is, like the old JSA transitioned into JSA Oban, the addition of Yanyans to the faction have really helped just close the loophole that kind of always existed. You now have reliable, bountiful access to smoke in this faction, which means that close combat is a real and present danger for your opponent all of the time. Now, jumping from warbands to our kind of skirmish elements in JSA Oban, we will start with the Ryuken Unit 9. These are our Ghost in the Shell reference models. If you've seen the JSA kits, you will recognize these almost immediately. Oh look, it's the Major. Oh look, it's Bato. Now, there are two very different profiles that you kind of have access to here, the forward deploying version or the hangback deployment zone version. So we'll kind of cover them both different equally, but both are definitely valuable. Possibly the easier to use and therefore the more valuable is the 23.1.5 SWC. Kind of remember, as noted, we usually find that we have ample spare SWC in JSA, so even two of these guys in a list is fine to take most of the time. And what you get from him is kind of solid deployment zone shell game frustration for your opponent. He's going to do a few different things. Firstly, he's going to lay a deployment zone shock mine. Now, as far as defensive additions go, that is very supplementary, but it's fine to have, particularly against stuff like impersonators, right, who might be threatening fire teams. We're not going to complain about that as an addition, but the main thing that he does is that, firstly, Mimetism 6 as an ARO piece can be very difficult to deal with, and he's under camouflage, single use, and he has a decoy, which means what you will usually do is you will place two decoys in ARO positions. Now, when you do this, make sure that the mine is placed inside 8 inches of both of them, or you will telegraph which one is real and which is the decoy. And then generally you will just hold this guy and not reveal unless your opponent gives you a really juicy shot. Your opponent then has to kind of deal with that. Discovering Mimetism 6 from a long way away is usually very challenging. And even once they discover the Ryuken, putting down Mimetism 6, particularly at very long range, right? He has an X-Visor. Don't be afraid to put him back in the deployment zone, making full use of the range bands that offers, just very challenging then to put down. And so while it's going to be pretty rare for a Ryuken to survive the game against an opponent that really decides they want to dislodge him, the Rocket Ryuken can project just an awful lot of different perspective, smoke and mirrors threats to your opponent for the cost of just a single troop and 23 points. I like the Ryuken Unit 9 Heavy Rocket Launcher a lot, and it's my preferred of the two profiles. Now, we then also have the forward deploying one. Now, while she does have decoy, just like the surprise attack camouflage one, it is worth noting that she does not have camouflage, which means she is vulnerable. For that reason, I'm actually going to suggest against taking the killer hacker profile. Now, you do have the option. It is something that you could choose to do, and if you think you can make that work, then by all means go ahead and do so. But one of the things to recognize is that Mimetism 6 models can be really difficult to engage. It's not easy to just round the corner and casual deal Mimetism 6. But the thing about being a killer hacker is that you are a hacker and therefore vulnerable to killer hacking. And especially a forward deploying killer hacker, not inside the protection area of your network, just exposed and alone, is baiting out pitches or fast pandas landing on her head and then having enemy killer hackers spool up and put her in the dirt without ever having to deal with the fact that she's Mimetism 6. So usually I'm going to recommend just the 22-point forward observer profile here. Sorry, forward deployment profile here. And even then, this is kind of a rare piece to use. I don't think she's particularly necessary in JSA, but she is a forward deploying mine layer. She does have decoy, which is particularly valuable, and the X-Visor lets her take engagements potentially at quite long range or enter into suppressive fire and have the suppressive fire be effective at long range. Overall, the means of getting maximum use out of her I find are fairly difficult. The submachine gun is an anemic weapon. You can't go into suppressive fire with the breaker pistols. There's a bit more in the way of tension on the 22-point Ryuken Unit 9, but she is something that is usable. And she is, strictly speaking, a rare case of a model that can take some active gunfighting and has an actual visual modifier not contingent on smoke to use as part of the offense. Generally speaking, I would lean towards like one Ryuken heavy rocket launcher as a good baseline, as a defensive piece who can transition into offense, take some surprise attack rocket shots, etc. That is fine to have in almost any JSA Oban list, but the forward deploying Ryuken, a bit more of a specialist piece, use more sparingly. Now, next up, in terms of skirmish style elements, what a profile, the Shakami. Now, straight up, generally speaking, recommend taking the multi-rifle profile here. That's just a personal preference. Both of them have eclipse grenades, which is one of the important things. Both of them have excellent close combat. The assault pistol contender profile does have an assault pistol, which is very nice. My experience is that if you are close enough to use the assault pistol, you are close enough just to start taking close combat attacks instead. It's a less valuable weapon on something like a Shakami, whereas the multi-rifle opens up attacks using the Shakami's mobility at longer range that just complements the piece nicely. Now, it is 5 points more for the multi-rifle. If you need to save those 5 points, there are far worse ways to do it than by downgrading to the assault pistol contender. But just as a baseline, I would usually start with the multi-rifle, and then if you need to cut those points, downgrade it. Now, what we get here otherwise is hypermobility and all of the tools that you might want to capitalize on that hypermobility. Good close combat, right? JSA, CC23 martial arts level 3 with an AP DACCW. If this guy connects, he will do a great deal of damage, and he's very good at connecting. Strictly speaking, CC23 martial arts level 3 is on the like low to intermediate end by JSA standards, but it is absolutely enough to do whatever you need against any non-CC expert. Armor 3 BTS 3 with 2 wounds is serviceably survivable, and he shouldn't be exposed to too much fire because he's got Fizz 14 with Eclipse grenades, true visibility control, which enables him to get into close combat. He's also very, very fast with 6-2 movement, super jump 3, forward deployment 4, and climbing plus. Now, as of time of recording, you can't combine climbing plus and super jump, i.e. you can't super jump onto a wall, but a 9-inch super jump should be enough to get you onto almost any ceiling if you need to, rooftop rather, which means that you really just move very far, very fast with this guy. Also, don't be afraid if you need a little bit of extra distance to declare super jump as the first short skill and then dodge as the second. He dodges on 14s and he moves 4 inches on the dodge, which means that in one order, you can theoretically move 13 inches with a Shakami. Now, Ballistic Skill 13 is not fantastic gunfighting, but he has Mimetism 6, and he can get into places where he will often be able to strip cover from your opponent or take attacks against things they didn't think could be hurt, so don't be afraid to use that multi-rifle if you need to, and he's a specialist operative. Only willpower 13, but he gets up the board incredibly easily, which means he will be in position to do mission objectives, which just makes him, by and large, an incredibly fun piece to play. Now, expensive, right? 47 points is you don't just get to splash a Shakami into your list. You need to very consciously include them and make space for them. But remember all of those things that we said about stuff like Kusotsu infantry. You can back up, you have the cheap line infantry to support expensive luxury pieces like that, and so the Shakami is absolutely within reach of JSA lists if you decide you want to include him. One of the most fun pieces to use in faction, and also coincidentally just an incredibly baller model. Now, next we have the Ninja package. There are a bunch of models that we might consider ninjas in JSA Oban. I'm going to focus on just 2 in terms of things that represent faction strengths and which I recommend. And the first of those is the Oniwaban. Now, this guy is my general recommended go-to if you want to play ninja games in JSA Oban, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, he has this really Fizz 18 infiltration, which just strongly incentivizes you to throw him across the table. You need to roll a 15 to land him outside your opponent's deployment zone. Combine that with hidden deployment and camouflage. Oniwaban are your version of things like Assassin for days, except they have true hidden deployment. They can't be discovered until they're ready to emerge from ambush, which means that some of the weaknesses that you might associate with an impersonation model, where they can be discovered and neutralized before they get to act, does not apply to an Oniwaban. Yes, you can, if your opponent has sensor, you should be aware of that. Sensor can reveal their position. But even then, your opponent is playing a guessing game. And if you do get into close combat with these guys, they're CC24, Martial Arts 4 and have Surprise Attack, which means that they will just annihilate anything that they touch. Now, you can pick basically any of the profiles except the Lieutenant profile. Don't take the Lieutenant profile. The Boarding Shotgun or Submachine Gun, it just comes down to do you have a point spare or not. Either is fine, and either will fulfill that fantasy of the ninja dropping off the rooftop and just absolutely decapitating some critical piece of your opponent. In terms of use of these guys, don't be afraid to leave them hidden for a little while if you think you can get away with it. As with things like parachutist deployment zone pieces, it can often be better to let your opponent's defense kind of unfold and have their resources begin to be stretched for like a turn before you reveal a piece like this, which is not a luxury that an impersonator has, right? Your opponent will always know where the impersonator is. They can take measures to defend against it, but because the Oniwaban is truly hidden, you have the luxury of playing them the same way you would a parachutist DZ model. They are a rare example of this really, really, really forward, aggressively positioned piece, if you want them to be, that can have time on their side, and you can just wait a turn, maybe even wait another turn, until the kill run that you're looking for appears. You have to make the judgment call on when the right time to reveal them is, but that actually is a judgment call that you get to make. That's the luxury that hidden deployment allows, which wouldn't be the case if these guys were a true impersonator. So play to those strengths. Don't play them as this is absolutely a turn one offensive element. It is sometimes a turn 1 offensive element, and sometimes a turn 2 offensive element, and sometimes even it's a turn 3 drop out of hiding then and only then to secure the kill that wins the game. Use these guys judiciously. Now, if that fantasy is compelling, here is Shinobukits, who is just the Oniwaban, but more. Hey look, it's CC25, Martial Arts 5. On top of that, she has Infiltration Phys equals 19, which means she forward infiltrates on a 16, which is quite reliable, and she has a couple of skills that are very relevant just in comparison to the Oniwaban. She has Climbing Plus and she has Smoke Grenades. Now, Climbing Plus is the more relevant of the two. Sometimes you just need to be able to get to a place, and the Oniwaban can't, and Oniwaban Shinobu Kitsune can. Now, in terms of downsides, firstly, that is a whopping points increase. She is 14 or 15 points more expensive than Oniwaban, and I cannot afford that in most of my lists. Even with things like Kasotsu Fire Teams, etc., she is expensive as hell. And secondly, she has a monofilament CCW. Now, she is a rare case where I'm actually pretty willing to tolerate that, because she is going to inflict so many saves on your opponent with MA5 and those scores that it's not usually going to be particularly rare for you to roll into close combat and then have your opponent attempt to pass 4 saves against monofilament. And so while like the Tanko has an issue where a lot of the time your opponent is just trying to roll 1 dice of an 8 or less, against Shinobu Kitsune, they're often going to be trying to roll 3 or 4 of an 8 or less, and that means she usually gets it done in one order. So for her, the monofilament weapon is not a downside, and yeah, she will just one-shot everything that she touches, basically. Now, does an Oniwaban also do that? Yeah, he has an EMCCW and almost as good close combat. He will also one-shot most things that he touches. So you are paying almost 50% more for kind of like just gratuitous additional upgrades. But if that's your thing, then by all means, go forth, find 15 points, pay for the gratuitous additional things. Every now and again, there will be a table you play on where that Climbing Plus especially really makes a difference. Now, from here, we jump into the tags, or tag singular. It is the Oyuroi Kabutai. Now, this girl is another one of those lieutenant candidates that makes having 17-point chain of command quite nice, and this is just generally a really solid and efficient tag. 78 points is slightly on the pricey side. I mean, it is relatively pricey for an armor 7 tag, but she is armor 7 against armor piercing rounds. That's enough to get you to save on decent numbers, and she's a ballistic skill 14 multi-HMG. If you want very big gun in JSA, this is it. This is your choice. If you want big armor piercing rounds going down range, you have to take the Oyuroi. And taking the Oyuroi really genuinely is fine. That is an eminently serviceable gun platform. It will usually have lieutenant and tactical awareness, which makes it a nice source of orders. It has crazy koalas and mine layers, which on a model with that many orders and that much mobility is nice both defensively and in terms of offensive use. And she has genuinely solid close combat, right? Like, CC23 Martial Arts Level 2 is one of the worst close combat attributes we've seen in JSA Oban so far, but she's a tag. Armor 7, BTS 3, and 3 structure, which means that, I didn't win the face-to-face roll. That's okay, I'll just go again. And if she connects, explosive at damage 3. Couple that with the fact that she has stealth, which is really useful on a model that fast, trying to do things like penetrate enemy hacking networks, and you have just a really solid and well-rounded choice. I have played her in N5 in JSA Oban. I have never felt bad about it. She's totally fine. Always remember as well, if your opponent is laying EM mines, that you have a minesweeper attached to her. Just drop the Kaburutu Hojo bot out and run it through the mines, and then proceed on your merry way. She's not going to feature in either of the lists that we'll showcase at the end of this episode, but I'm pretty sure I've done a battle report that included her in the past, and I was very happy with how she performed. Now, just as we jump into the list, we're going to cover a few more profiles that it does behoove me to mention, and one of those is the Carakuri Special Project. I do not personally like these. Now, yes, they can be linked. Yes, they are very, very durable. They have 3 structure and immunity enhanced, and remote presence, which means that if they drop unconscious and you have an engineer nearby, which you might in the form of Yuriko Oda, they can be recovered relatively easily. However, they aren't cheap, right? Even the cheapest of them is 31 points, and their resiliency is really the only thing they have going for them. In terms of trying to actually win a gunfight, these things are pants. They are terrible at it. And so, for that reason, if you play Karakuri, it's really important to recognize that the optimal number of orders to actually spend on them is very close to 0. You should think of these more as ARO pieces and speed bumps for your opponent and use them that way instead. If you are doing that, then usually the optimal number to take is going to be 2. And for that kind of role, I mostly lean towards the emitter chain rifle Panzerfaust profiles, where you just move them forward a little and set them up and make them your opponent's problem. They are extremely difficult to perish. They will have chain rifles for close-end defense. They will have Panzerfausts and emitters for ranged AROs. And at that point, yep, Ballistic Skill 13 is not going to win any prizes as far as gunfighting goes, but 2 dice in ARO on a model that can just survive and survive and survive thanks to all of that structure and immunity enhanced. That's the ideal use case for these. Just spend like 1 or 2 orders if you need to, that's like maximum, to get them forward, and then just make them your opponent's issue. Late in the game, yep, they are forward observers. Maybe they move forward, maybe they press some buttons, maybe they do some mission objectives, maybe they're points in zones. The only thing that's absolutely critical with these is just never under any circumstance try and take an active turn gunfight unless you have absolutely no choice. They are not built for that. They are built for surviving and being annoying. If you use them that way, they are much less likely to disappoint. Next up, just to mention him, we have YJimbo, Sword for Hire. Now he has a motorized and a non-motorized version, separated really only by like a single point. The non-motorized version is much slower, but is not on a silhouette for motorcycle. Now he has Mine Layer, he has no wound incapacitation, he has Crazy Koalas, he has smoke grenades on Fizz 14 and a smoke grenade launcher on Ballistic Skill 12. He has very good close combat with a really nice DA CCW and Martial Arts 4 and CC 24, but he's also kind of just not hugely necessary in JSA anymore. This is a piece that you take if you feel like taking it, if you want to. If you're going to support him to get into close combat and absolutely motorize some things, he's totally fine for that. But a little bit like Miyamoto Masashi, he does things that you just get elsewhere in the faction kind of incidentally if you want to. Now, he's cheap and he's fast, and the presence of the crazy koalas means that worst case you use his irregular order on the first turn just to move forward and lay a koala to set him up for a subsequent attack run. And the smoke grenades mean that sort of in combination he has much higher utility than a piece like Musashi. He's not just a melee missile, but most of what he is a melee missile. He used to be very, very important in JSA lists because there was just no smoke anywhere else to be had. But now that Yan-Yans exist, YJimbo will usually be your 3rd irregular piece, and that's just something to kind of consider. He is fun to use, but Silhouette 4 can be kind of an ass to get round corners. He's a little bit slower than you might think. He's a sometimes food in JSA lists. Definitely takeable, but not something that is even remotely close to compulsory. Next up, and kind of just to mention them, ninjas. Actually don't recommend taking them, mostly because you have access to Oniwaban. Now, you can take these guys. The Killer Hacker, for example, is an able specialist in the midfield if you absolutely need to. Climbing Plus actually makes these guys quite good at deploying on rooftops in safe positions and then coming down as and when they need to, but I don't find they fit into my JSA lists terribly often. I don't regret them when they're present, but one of the things about a piece like a ninja is that it often wants to kind of wait until its moment comes, which might be in turn 2 or might be in turn 3. And Oniwaban is higher payoff in that moment, and because of how much more of the board he threatens because he's positioned kind of close to your opponent's deployment zone much of the time, his time is more likely to come a little bit earlier. And what that means is that the fact that a hidden deployment model is an order that you aren't having generated until it reveals it's just a slightly lower likelihood of adding up to 2 lost orders over the course of the game for the Oniwaban than it is for the ninja. Either way, I don't recommend taking these in large multiples, right? Like 2 hidden deployment troops is usually the most I would recommend because you have to kind of like wait for their moment, which means that you'll often be giving up orders. You're giving up tactical flexibility at minimum because those orders are reserved for them until they reveal. And so, despite, for example, the AVA3, ninjas are something you want just like 1 or maybe 2 pieces of that type. And if I'm taking pieces of that type, usually one of them will be an Oniwaban. But ninjas do still have a role. Sometimes you just need a midfield specialist. Sometimes the scenario is going to want your opponent to move up into the midfield. And at that point, the fact that they are just infiltrating to the halfway line most of the time is not an issue for ninjas, and the coming plus can be really relevant. But my general advice is that despite the fantasy of ninjas, be really judicious adding these tier lists. Use them just occasionally. Now, finally, just as the last profile to kind of cover, I should talk about something that's not amongst the obvious profiles, Freelance Operator Samsa. I just think he's neat. Strictly speaking, he's one of the most dangerous gunfighters in JSA because he has mimetism and a plasma rifle, and this is the kind of faction that can afford to splash 26 points on a piece like this. You can usually find those points for Samsa if you want to use him. He's fun and jumpy and dangerous, and sometimes he fails one save and dies immediately. But most of the time, he is an amusing weight on your opponent's mind, and on the turn, he breaks his decoy and goes and takes some attacks. This has got a pretty good chance of doing it. You don't have to connect with, like, you do not have to connect with many plasma rifle hits to do a bunch of damage. Plasma is like that as an ammunition type, and so just as a if you haven't played with this, consider it because he's very fun. My final recommendation goes to Freelance Operator Samsa. Now, closing out as usual with list or lists, the first of these is I wanted to showcase what a heavy infantry banzai kind of charge link can look like. And so in this one, we have maximal order count JSA with a Daiokai with heavy machine gun, leading Damaru Lieutenant +1 order, Damaru Forward Observer, Ayamo, and a Tenko. Now, the Damaru, Ayama, and the Tenko will all count as Damaru, which means this counts as a 4-person fire team, which means the Daiokai gets to ballistic skill 14, which is nice. And between the Tenko's Disco Baller and all the other sources of smoke in this list, you should be able to either suppress the enemy with a Daiokai or use smoke to get into close combat, at which point this list will rip shit up. Now, kind of as foreshadowed when we talked about Damaru, we do have the Damaru Forward Observer in there. If you are playing a mission that does not require your Link team to have a specialist in it to do the mission objectives, cut him like a hot rock and use those points on anything else, because 27 points for a Damaru with a combi rifle sucks. But I wanted to have a specialist in that Link team because I didn't know what you would be using this list for, and that's the way to do it. Otherwise, we have the Rushi, Aragotto, and Kroshi Rider fire team. As noted, really like it. Deploy them somewhere different to the Damaru fire team, and use that mobility to your advantage. We then have a single for defense Ryuken surprise attack, heavy rocket launcher camouflage mine layer piece, and a Warcore, because the Warcore is a specialist, and you can always turn it to order regular if you need to. That means we have, in this first combat group, it's effectively a 13 order combat group, because we have an NCO with 2 lieutenant orders to spend, and tactical awareness from Oyama, which means that that fire team can really motor, can close the gap, and do some distance. Damage. Do some damage. I've been recording for a while. In Combat Group 2, we have pretty standard, like, it's just support stuff. We have a little fire team of a Kasatsu Thunderbolt, a Kasatsu Hacker, and a Kenpai Chain of Command. Use that Thunderbolt if you absolutely have to. Use it very sparingly. Mostly what we're looking to do with that fire team is just throw out a Crazy Koala at some point. Maybe spend some orders hacking through the Rushi if need be. And otherwise, it's home for a chain of command, and it's fueling the Yan-Yans. My anticipation is that you're going to be laying a fair bit of smoke to support the advance of either the Rushi or the Damaru. You should deploy 1 Yan-Yan supporting each of those fire teams, and just use all of your Combat Group 2 orders to lay smoke to allow them to advance and do what it is that they want to do. The Rushi wants to smoke shoot, the Damaru wants to close to assault range. Just use those Yan-Yans as enablers and tips of the spear. and then throw them away to do some damage a little bit later in the game. Now, one thing to note, although you could absolutely do a Banzai Rush across the table and get to the enemy deployment zone with this list, I would probably recommend against that as a first turn play unless you really saw an opportunity. Usually instead what you want to do is, do some heavy machine gunfighting, do some smoke shooting, clear out ARO pieces, maybe press a button or two, just set yourself up in a decent position, and then on something like turn 2, step on the gas and really commit with the heavy infantry fire team. Generally not recommending them as a first turn assault, although sometimes your opponent will just have a weak spot in their deployment zone, or you'll see the ability to make that attack, in which case go for it. Now, our second list is not running any of those kind of samurai at all, and instead is trying to do just a few things that I felt were interesting in terms of showing off what some of the independent elements you can get out of JSA Oban can do in terms of a mix of well-rounded gunfighting and smoke and specialist operatives and mobility, and also things like deployable ammunition and equipment. And so in that vein, we have a Shakami, because I couldn't write a list at some point without including a Shakami. They're super fun. Strictly speaking, if I was really willing to squeeze for points, I could try and duo one. I'm not willing to do that in this case, but we do have a Shakami present. They're fun and they're awesome. We then have the same fire team as before, Kroshi Rider, Rushi, and an Aragotto. But you will see in Combat Group 2 a Pangolin Evo hacker. We are really intending to do some damage with the Rushi in this list. We then have a Kasotsu fire team with a Daiokai in it. So this is 2 Kasotsu hacker, a Kasotsu Thunderbolt, and a Kenpai Chain of Command. The Kroshi Rider is Lieutenant in this particular case. She will spend her LT order at some point during the game making an attack, and the Kenpai is there to pick up the reins when she inevitably dies. That is 4 Kasotsu or Kasotsu equivalent troops, which means, again, the Daiokai is Ballistic Skill 14, Burst 5. Now, this list is a 9-6 split, mostly so that you can swap things between combat groups if you need to, but also because of some mind games. In Combat Group 2, we have a few things I think are particularly interesting. We have a second Rushi, but this one has a Shock Mind Dispenser. That is intending to make use of the fact that we have baggage in the list, right? We have the Kasotsu with Crazy Koalas, and we have the Rushi with Mind Dispenser. One of the things we're looking to do with this list is not just give out support wear to usually the MSV2 Rushi, but also just yeet mines everywhere with the Mine Dispenser and the Crazy Koalas to make attacking us or getting into the midfield really difficult for our opponents. The Rushi Mine Dispenser in that vein is a really good way to use surplus orders in Group 2, because there's a little bit less of a requirement for Yan-Yans to be Pathfinders in this list. You'll want one supporting the advance of the Kroshi Rider team, but the second is a bit more free roaming and can kind of bide its time. We then have, again, a War Correspondent, because I needed to be a bit cheap, and the reason why we needed to be a bit cheap even with everything else in this list is that this is a list with an Oniwaban. Now, he is in Group 2, with a very obvious hole missing from Group 1, with the idea basically being that if your opponent goes, oh, I think there's an Oniwaban in Group 1, I'm going to ship orders from them, he might be able to launch a turn 1 attack run, but he's not obligated to. You can kind of just hold him in position where he needs to be. You can wait, all of the things that we talked about, potentially jumping him into Group 1 later in the game if need be, or more likely just using that command token to convert some orders and have him make a 3 or 4 or 5 order attack out of Combat Group 2. On a turn, it will do something really decisive. This is playing more into the multiple independent elements that JSA can do. It's also got solid deployment zone hacking defense because it has 2 Rushi and therefore 2 repeaters, and it has 2 Kasotsu hackers. This is trying to make a list that is difficult to attack, can make itself more difficult to attack over the course of the game by doing things like throwing out mines, and has lots of mobility and some infiltration, but still has plenty of able gunfighting. So that wraps this video up. Slightly on the longer side, but Oban are an interesting and fun faction to talk about, and I hope very much that you've enjoyed this. Just as a reminder, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. Otherwise, as always, we'll be back next week with more content. I hope very much you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.